I'd lived on my 12-acre farm for nearly 8 years before trouble came knocking in the form of the HOA, nestled at the edge of a newly developed suburban neighborhood. My land was an oasis, fruit orchards, grazing pastures, a modest vegetable garden, and a barn that housed my animals. I had bought this land to escape the suffocating rules of homeowners associations. Yet here they were, standing on my porch, telling me that I needed to join. It started as a polite visit from the HOA president, Mr. Grayson, a sharply dressed man in his 50s with the smuggest smile I'd ever seen. "Your property technically falls within our jurisdiction now," he had said, his voice dripping with fake politeness, "and we'd love to welcome you into the community." I knew what that meant. Annual dues, arbitrary regulations, and a slow erosion of the freedom I had built for myself. "No, thanks," I replied firmly, shutting the door before he could continue. That was my first mistake. The second mistake was assuming they would simply take no for an answer. A few weeks later, I found a letter in my mailbox demanding a mandatory compliance review of my property to ensure it met the HOA's aesthetic standards. I laughed at the audacity and ignored it. Days later, I came home to find a citation tacked to my fence, an official-looking notice citing violations such as excessive weed growth along the edges of my pasture and unauthorized structures in the form of my greenhouse and barn. Infuriated, I marched straight to the HOA office in town, where a receptionist smugly informed me that I had 30 days to address these issues or face fines. "But I'm not even part of the HOA," I argued, but she merely shrugged. "All properties within the neighborhood limits must adhere to the guidelines," she said. "It's in the bylaws." That's when it hit me. They were trying to force my hand. I began receiving letters almost weekly, each one more aggressive than the last. Then came the fines. They started small. $54 failure to remove an unsanctioned structure, $100 for refusing to submit landscaping plans. When I ignored them, they escalated, doubling, tripling, until I was supposedly thousands of dollars in debt to an organization I never signed up for. Neighbors I had once been friendly with suddenly stopped waving when I passed by. A few even warned me in hushed voices that Mr. Grayson wasn't the type to take defiance lightly. One morning, I woke up to find my front gate padlocked shut, a no trespassing sign stapled to it. The HOA had placed a lien on my property. My lawyer assured me they had no legal grounds, but that didn't stop them from harassing me. Someone poisoned my well, turning my livestock's water supply into a foul, undrinkable sludge. A county inspector showed up out of nowhere, claiming there had been reports of zoning violations. Then the anonymous threat started. "You don't belong here. Sell now, before it's too late." I tried to ignore them, but deep down I knew I was at war. And then one night, everything changed. It started with a smell, something acrid in the air, sharp and smoky, even before I saw the glow. I had been lying in bed, exhausted from yet another fruitless day of fighting off the HOA's relentless harassment. The fines, the threats, the sabotages, they had taken their toll. But none of it had prepared me for the hell that would unfold that night. I sat up abruptly, sniffing the air, and immediately, dread curled in my gut like a coiled snake. Smoke, thick, pungent, unnatural. My heart slammed against my ribs as I threw off the covers and ran to the window. And that's when I saw it. An inferno raging across my fields, bright orange flames licking at the dark sky, consuming my pastures, my orchard, my barn. For a second, I couldn't move. The sheer horror of it all paralyzed me. Then, adrenaline kicked in. I bolted down the stairs, shoving my feet into boots as I grabbed my phone and called 911. My fingers trembled as I pressed the buttons, my voice cracking as I screamed into the receiver. "Fire! My farm is on fire. I need help." The dispatcher's voice was calm, too calm, as she assured me that firefighters were on the way. But I knew. Out here, where my property sat on the farthest edge of the county service area, help was at least 15 minutes out, maybe longer. And by then, it would be too late. I ran outside, barely registering the scorching heat pressing against my skin. My animals, I had to get to them. The barn was already an inferno, flames curling around its wooden beams like the fingers of a vengeful god. The terrified screams of my livestock cut through the roar of the fire, sending a shudder through me. I sprinted to the barn door, but the handle was searing hot. I jerked my hand back with a hiss of pain, the metal branding my palm. Desperation clawed at my throat. I couldn't let them burn alive. I grabbed the old metal rod I used to secure the barn gate and slammed it against the latch, over and over, each strike reverberating through my bones. Finally, with a sharp crack, the door gave way. A wave of blistering heat rushed out, nearly knocking me off my feet. My horses screamed, their eyes wide with terror, their bodies pressed against the farthest wall. Smoke filled my lungs as I stumbled inside, coughing, my vision swimming. I unlatched their stalls, one by one, slapping their flanks, screaming at them to run. They hesitated, too panicked to move, until finally the lead mare bolted, the others following in a stampede of hooves and terror. I turned to my goats, my chickens, frantically opening pens, unlatching gates. Flames danced along the hay bales, catching onto the wooden beams overhead. The roof groaned, embers raining down like fiery snow. I was running out of time. My lungs burned, my head spun. I staggered toward the exit, just as the rafters above gave a sickening crack and collapsed behind me, sealing the barn in a raging inferno. I barely made it out, collapsing onto the dirt just as the fire truck sirens wailed in the distance. My chest heaved as I gulped in air, my vision blurred with tears, of smoke, of devastation, of fury. My farm was gone, the orchard I had painstakingly cultivated for years, reduced to embers. My vegetable garden, the pastures, my equipment, all swallowed by flames. My home had been spared barely, but the land that sustained me was nothing more than blackened earth and smoldering ruin. The firefighters worked for hours, but the damage was done. The fire had started in multiple locations at once. They told me that wasn't natural. That wasn't an accident. That was arson. And I knew exactly who was responsible. The HOA had been escalating their attacks for months, but I never thought they would go this far. It wasn't just about forcing me out. It was personal now. They wanted to break me. They wanted me ruined. I stood there, staring at the wreckage of my livelihood, my hands clenched in a fist so tight my nails bit into my palms. That night, as I sat on my porch, the scent of burnt wood still thick in the air, I made a decision. They thought they could bully me, intimidate me, destroy everything I had worked for. But they had made one fatal mistake. They underestimated me. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to take them down. The morning after the fire, I stood amid the ruins of my farm, the air still thick with the acrid stench of burnt wood, hay, and death. My once lush fields were nothing more than blackened wastelands. The barn was a collapsed skeleton of charred beams, and the orchard, years of careful cultivation, had been reduced to ash. The pain of loss gnawed at me, but beneath it burned something fiercer, something more potent than grief. Rage. I wasn't going to let the HOA win. They had gone too far, and I was going to make sure they paid for it. I started by calling the fire marshal. The initial report had already confirmed arson, but I needed more than that. I needed proof. Over the next few weeks, I worked with investigators, scouring every inch of my property. That's when I found it, buried in the dirt near my eastern fence line, were the remains of accelerant canisters. The fire hadn't just been set. It had been meticulously planned, ignited in multiple places to ensure maximum destruction. But the real break came when I checked my security cameras. I had installed them months ago after the HOA's harassment had started escalating. Most of them had melted in the fire, but the one by my back fence had survived, barely. The footage was grainy, warped by the heat, but it was enough. The camera had captured 3 figures sneaking onto my property that night. One of them, unmistakably, was Mr. Grayson, the HOA president himself. I watched sickened as they poured accelerant along my barn and pastures, striking matches with casual indifference. My hands shook, but not with fear, with fury. I took the footage straight to the police, and within days, 3 arrests were made. Mr. Grayson and 2 HOA board members were charged with arson, trespassing, and reckless endangerment. But I wasn't satisfied with just criminal charges. They had taken everything from me: my livelihood, my animals, my home safety. I wanted more than just their imprisonment. I wanted financial justice. I hired the best lawyer I could afford and filed a civil lawsuit against the HOA for $600,000 in damages. The case was complex. HOAs often had legal loopholes to shield them from individual liability, but my attorney was relentless. We built our case brick by brick. The history of harassment, the fraudulent liens, the poisoned well, the fines, the intimidation. The fire was just a culmination of months of coordinated attacks, a campaign designed to force me off my own land. The courtroom was packed on the day of the trial. The HOA had hired a slick corporate lawyer, a man who smirked as he dismissed my claims as baseless accusations from a disgruntled homeowner. But he wasn't ready for the evidence we had. First came the fire marshal's testimony. He confirmed that the fire had been deliberately set and that accelerants had been used. Then came the security footage. The moment the grainy video played, the unmistakable image of Mr. Grayson and his cohorts setting my farm ablaze. The courtroom fell silent. The jury's expressions shifted from skepticism to disgust. Then I took the stand. I spoke about the years I had spent building my farm, the sacrifices, the hard work. I described the harassment, the threats, the fear that had taken root in my life. And then I told them about that night, how I had fought to save my animals, how I had watched my barn collapse in flames, how I had woken up to nothing but ash and loss. By the time I finished, even the judge looked affected. The HOA's defense crumbled. Grayson's lawyer tried to argue that my land had been an eyesore, that the HOA was simply trying to enforce community standards. But there was no excuse for arson, no justification for destruction. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. The verdict? The HOA was found liable for all damages. The judge awarded me the full $600,000 in damages, plus additional punitive fines against Mr. Grayson and his accomplices. The HOA itself was forced to dissolve under financial ruin, and Grayson and his cronies, they were sentenced to prison for felony arson. When I walked out of that courtroom, I felt something I hadn't in months. Relief. Justice had been served. My farm might have been reduced to ash, but I wasn't beaten. With that money, I rebuilt. Stronger, bigger, and without an HOA to harass me, I finally had the peace I had fought so hard for. They thought they could break me. They were wrong.